Hello, everyone. Welcome to our reading survey of the Caribbean. This is a graduate level class, and I'm going to do a little book review for each one of the books that we'll be reading. Hopefully, this will help you as you approach these books. I do want to say you have to read in this course at a graduate level, which means you have to read smart and fast. You don't have time to read every single page, every sentence, every paragraph. So as you're approaching these books, learn to read strategically and prioritize. For sure, read the first chapter, the last chapter, scan through the middle, the chapter headings, read the first paragraph of the chapter. A little note is that the first sentence of a paragraph is the topical sentence, and we'll usually tell you what the paragraph is about. And the same thing is true of the first paragraph of a chapter. The last paragraph of the chapter usually gives you a summary of what the chapter talked about. So there are ways that you can read fast, and you have to in graduate school. Also, make sure to look up at least 2 or 3 reviews of the book. To look at the critiques and the strengths of the book from the point of view of several authors. You can find those reviews if you go into the library research area in the A to Z database, and you go to JSTOR, then the A to Z, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and then down to JSTOR, and there you put in your search parameters. I'll show you more about how to do that if you haven't done it before later. And just look for reviews, book reviews. So today I want to talk about one of my favorite books, which is James Michener's Caribbean. I read this book 30 years ago and enjoyed it. In fact, I've read a lot of his books. But I had no idea when I read The Caribbean that I'd be the Director of Academic Programs for the Latin American and Caribbean Center. So we're trying to reemphasize the Caribbean, especially the West Indian, British West Indian, and the French Antilles, as well as the Spanish. So that's why I created this course. This is the first time I'll be teaching it. I really enjoyed preparing for it. I've read at least 20 of the books that you'll find in the Caribbean bibliography. I'm still reading more along with you this semester. So I'm going to be talking about the books that I've already read, and this is going to be somewhat impressionistic and off the top of my head. I'm not going to do a lot of preparation. So I recently reread Caribbean for the second time, and I have to say I immensely enjoyed it the second time that I read it. I got so much more out of it, partly because I've been to Cuba and Puerto Rico, and I have plans to go to other parts of the Caribbean, and I've studied it in the history department, and so I'm much more familiar with the area now, and so it came alive for me. Plus, I was preparing this course. So here's the cover of the book. It doesn't really matter to me which version you get. Find a good deal financially. There's also some websites where you can download a free PDF. The novel was published in 1989. I think he wrote it in 1986. The novel explores the history of the Caribbean, telling the arrival of Columbus. That actually the first chapter even begins before that with a conflict between Taínos and Carib Indians. And I'm trying to remember which island they clashed in. I'll have to look that up. Of course, it's fictional. It also goes through the days of the Buccaneers and Caribbean piracy, the rise of the Jamaican sugar planters, the rise of color-based racism and social hierarchy, and it moves all the way up from before Columbus all the way up to the present day. It's a masterful book. So the author is James Albert Michener. He was born in 1907 and died in 1997. He was an American author. He wrote more than 40 books. Most of them are very long fictional family sagas covering the lives of many generations and geographic locales. And he is very particular about incorporating historical detail.
He served in the South Pacific in World War II in the Navy as a naval historian, and he took from his notes as a historian in the South Pacific and wrote his first book, Tales of the South Pacific. And so that's how he came about into this career. He writes historical fiction. Um, I've recently come to appreciate literature and historical fiction as an alternative window to look at the culture, society, and the history, the context of a particular area. I've just taught a course recently on learning Latin American history through literature, and I read for the second or third time and taught 8 or 9 books in that course, which give insights into the historical period in which they were written. And so what historical fiction does is it engages your imagination in understanding the historical processes. So James H. Michener uses a lot of history in his books. I found every chapter to be historically accurate. He also creates fictional characters because he tries to create a narrative, a storyline that is not always possible to do with strict empirical history. And so as we go through, we'll discuss which characters are fictional and which characters are historical. Sometimes there may be a character that's a historical composite of several different historical figures. And so we'll discuss that in this book. I want to make a comment about the English word anachronism, which comes from Greek, 2 words in Greek, ana, out of, and chronos, out of time. So an anachronism is something that's out of its time. It's taken out of context. An example would be if you're reading about Alexander the Great and his wars of conquest and the creation of the Hellenic Empire, but you bring into your reading and your attempt to read and understand both Alexander the Great as a historical figure plus the time period that he lived in. If you try to bring into that a 2021 set of norms and values and assumptions, perspectives, you're going to do an injustice to Alexander the Great and to the time period, because it wasn't 2021. It was something like 600. No, it wasn't even that. It was like 200 or 300 BC, I think. And it was a Greek culture. It was actually Macedonian culture and Greek. And so to be faithful to history, we have to try to set aside our own cultural prejudices or cultural biases, or maybe to put it in a less pejorative term, our own cultural preferences, and try to understand the way people viewed things, the meanings they attached to words in the time that it was written. That's especially important in history as a discipline. So be careful for anachronism in this book, because I'm going to give you a trigger warning. There are some parts of the book, particularly 2 chapters, that use words, racial words, that are unacceptable in today's society and discourse. So I had some debate with myself about using this book. He wrote the book in 1986 when standards of rhetoric were very different. And also, as a good historical writer, he tried to be faithful and accurately describing his characters in their own terms and their own time period or context. If someone was a bad person, he didn't try to make them nice, or vice versa. And Atlantic slavery or Caribbean plantation slavery was not nice. It was terrible. It was tragic. It was dark. And he's painting a portrait, and he has to use dark colors as well as light. And so as he's describing these cultural and social settings, he has to use some dark colors. He has to describe some pretty evil attitudes and some barbaric actions on the behalf of some of the white British plantation owners in particular. So there are 2 chapters where racial terms are used that are offensive today. I'm also using this book in an undergraduate course, and I have a RTF copy that I was able to convert from a PDF, and I'm going to offer them the option of reading it with those words blacked out. I'm just trying to be sensitive. So let me know if you think this might bother you, and we will discuss alternatives. Both chapters in which he uses this, where he uses these terms, perhaps a little excessively, they fit in the time narrative. Slavery was not color-based primarily before 1690. In the 1500s and early 1600s, slaves were often white. And of course, the Spaniards enslaved indigenous peoples in the islands. And it was only later that they began to forcibly coerce Africans and bring them from Africa to the Caribbean. And this racial ideology gradually developed over the 1600s with a financial motivation, and it eventually became entrenched as color-based racism. So he actually illustrates this very well in his book, because you hardly find the use of any of those words up until about 1700. And then there's 2 chapters that deal with plantation systems in the 1700s and the early 1800s. And that's when he puts this word in the mouth of these abusive white British plantation owners. And of course, he attributes the word to where it should be attributed, that is, to the slave owners, who were abusive and looking to justify their inhumanity. And so the bad guys used the bad word, not the good guys, to put it real bluntly. So I wanted to make these qualifications before you read the book. Keep in mind anachronism, and also try to look at the historical value of this timeline, and feel free to critique it. If you don't like the way he approaches history, if you feel like he does injustice to history, if you're more than willing to critique him in a spirited fashion. So the chapters are a hedge of Croton. Croton is a particular plant that bears flowers of various colors. And I can't remember the name of the island. I think it might have been a fictional island, All Saints. But it was in the Lesser Antilles. And the Arawaks were already living on the island, and the Caribs arrived from the south, which is pretty faithful to the historical process as anthropologists understand it today. The Arawaks were already occupying, and when I say Arawaks, we're speaking of various tribes of the Taínos. The Taínos were Arawaks, and they spoke the Arawak language. They were very densely populated in the island of Hispaniola, which is today Dominican Republic and Haiti. They lived in Cuba. They also lived south of Hispaniola in the Lesser Antilles, and they had been there for some time. The Caribs came out of the Orinoco Valley of Venezuela, as the Arawaks had before them, and they began to travel by canoe up through Grenada, and then I'm not sure the exact order of the islands: Grenada, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, Dominica. I think I said that. And they began to travel up those islands, island by island, and if there were Arawaks already living on the island, they would conquer them, take their wives to be their mates, and kill the men. And the legend, or the legend has it that they would any brave Arawak men, they would kill them and eat their heart. They would practice cannibalism. It's not, I don't believe it was cannibalism for calories, but cannibalism as a sort of a religio-mythical absorption of the qualities of those that they conquered. However, they had a very fierce and barbaric reputation with the Spanish, and later the British and French, whereas the Arawaks or the Taínos were amazingly hospitable and peaceful, and they had a very peaceful farming society. So the very first chapter, he engages with the conflict between these two groups. And then the Death of Greatness takes us up to the Yucatan Peninsula in the island of Cozumel. He is including the Mayans in the greater circum-Caribbean. Different people take a different approaches to what exactly constitutes the Caribbean. This chapter 2 talks about the demise or the decline of the Mayans, and speculates a little bit on whether the Taino Indians that were living in Cuba may have traveled there from the Yucatan Peninsula as opposed to up from Venezuela. Then in chapter 3, we get into Christopher Columbus in Hispaniola. Michener creates he sets the chapter after the death of Christopher Columbus, when the Emperor Charles V sends one of his friends to do research on the truth about whether Christopher Columbus was a good man or a bad man, or whether he was a terrible administrator, as some people believe, whether he was really trying to serve the glory of God, or whether he was just out to make it rich. And it's a clever way of approaching it, because it approaches the evidence pro and con, and basically leaves the reader to decide at the end what you think of Christopher Columbus. Then the Spanish Lake might be my favorite chapter. This is number 4. It's the Adventures of Sir Francis Drake. And he does an amazing job with this. It's a very long chapter, showing this lifelong bitter enmity between Sir Francis Drake and the Spanish Empire. A friend or a relative of his was burned at the stake by the Spanish. He was an English Protestant, and so he declared personal war on the Spanish Empire and carried it out as a privateer in the Caribbean. And so you begin to learn some of the differences between privateer, pirate, and then later buccaneer. And we'll get that in the Buccaneer chapter, which is 5-6. It deals with the stories of Henry Morgan of Port Royal in Jamaica, and one of the characters from Barbados, who is marginalized and runs into some problems, ends up running off and becoming a buccaneer rather than dealing with Barbadian society. And that's in Big Storms in Little England, which is the history of Barbados. Then the sugar interest, if you feel like you might be offended by the uses of some of these unacceptable words, you can skip it. It deals with a fictional story around the island of St. John's in what is today the American Virgin Islands, and the Caribbean sugar monopoly. A Wedding on Nevis is an account of Horatio Nelson, who was in the Caribbean during this time and was seeking a wife. The Creoles, I loved this chapter, the Creoles. It's a chapter on the history of Guadeloupe, and it tells the story of the arrival of Victor Hughes, who was a true historical person. He arrived in Guadeloupe with the declaration of the end of abolition of slavery, and also with a guillotine, and became sort of a monster in the way he tyrannically imposed the French Revolution on the island of Guadeloupe. The Tortured Land deals with Haiti. It's an excellent chapter, the Haitian Revolution. Then, if you are concerned that you might be triggered, you can skip martial law. This deals with an important historical development in Jamaica, the Morant Bay Rebellion, which took place in 1865 through some very unjust things on the part of the British government. And it does have some important historical value, but it's also one of the almost at the peak of the racism of the British sugar planters and landowners. Letters of Introduction is about a fictional island, All Saints Island, which is kind of based on St. Lucia. and it gives a Caribbean perspective of the pre-World War II relationship between the United Kingdom and Germany, and it also introduces some of the complexity of the racial hierarchy in the islands, which is far more complex than Latin America and more complex, for it goes without saying, than the United States, where things tend to be black or white. I personally love The Scholar. It's a fictional story of a young Trinidadian, a brilliant young man from Trinidad who is Hindu, who travels to the University of West Indies. And then when he graduates, he has to apply to graduate school, and his mentor encourages him to go to the United Kingdom, but he wants to go to the United States, so he goes to Miami. So it kind of brings it home for those of us that live here in Miami. And then he ends up at the University of Miami, and then he runs into some problems, kind of a jam with his student visa. And I think we will all be able to relate to this living here in Miami and understanding how the culture works. Then Rasta Man is an excellent chapter which deals with a Rastafarian who arrives in one of the islands. I think it's All Saints Island again. And it does a good job of showing Rastafarian belief and practices and some of the motivations behind Rastafarianism. And then The Twins is a fictional story of two Cuban refugees who return to Cuba, have a meeting with Fidel Castro, reluctantly at the request of the president, who's trying to open a channel for negotiations. Then some tragedy strikes when they return to Miami. And those of you that live in Miami, again, will recognize the dilemma of Cuban policy. The Golden Sea then kind of wraps it up. It's the last chapter, and it brings several threads to a conclusion in a very satisfying way. So I really loved this book. I really appreciate trying to imagine, feel, smell, sense history, not only read about names and dates, and I believe with this historical fiction you can do that. So I hope you'll get started on it as soon as possible. It's a long book. You can also listen to it on Audible. You don't have to get through the whole thing in order to write your reading response, but do as much as you can. All right, thank you very much. We'll talk soon.